I'll just hand over to Simon. Over to you, brother.
Cool. Thank you, Ben. Cool. Yeah. So today's topic is liminal. Uh, this is something that is kind of increasingly becoming near and dear to my heart. It's something that I'm trying to kind of think through its kind of implications in philosophy. So, as it's like maybe not the most well-known term, I'll kind of like start off with the definition. So, comes from the Latin of limen, meaning kind of like threshold, but kind of commonly understood as kind of something that exists between states, and can quite often imply this idea of like transitorily moving between states. So that like quite often in the idea of in the kind of definitions that people often are working with, it has a sense of like moving between states. Um, I think like it's not to be confused with something like centrism or just kind of general vagueness. I think it's definitely something much more radical than that, at least like to me, like how I've been kind of thinking about it. And like I like an analogy that I kind of like think about a lot is just kind of like kind of quantum logic, right? Like where things can both be in two states at once kind of thing. Um like the reason why this has kind of been coming up for me is and kind of why it came up this week was because last week one of the suggestions was kind of the best kind of political system, and this is for me where kind of ideas of liminality really start coming into play, where I've been kind of more recently trying to kind of think, can I actually defend the position of wanting um, a kind of in no particular order of their importance, kind of libertarian, communist, and anarchist, feminist, free market kind of political system. Basically, you know, there's a whole bunch of competing ideologies that sort of form my thinking of politics. You know, I'm suspicious of government in many ways, kind of thing. At the same time, I don't want to be in constant local meetings figuring out like sewage systems. So I want some central planning. I want kind of free markets where they make sense. But I think one thing that I notice is often when we're talking about kind of ideas, we tend to not place them in kind of like a superposition with one another. You know, we're often kind of pitting one ideology versus another ideology, and then that kind of makes me think, I guess, a bit about the idea of why are our brains so resistant to this? You know, we seem to kind of be drawn to kind of definite categories that we work with. And then if that's the case and that's misleading, then how are we to kind of best organize ourselves in terms of our kind of own thinking to kind of navigate between these kind of structures of thought? Um, so yeah, areas where like I think this like comes up outside of philosophy is kind of like I've already kind of mentioned physics, also kind of mathematics. Mathematics, I mentioned not because we should kind of base philosophy off of some kind of like rigorous maths, but just because it's interesting at our most like formal on our most formal kind of logical systems, there is still these concepts of liminality. If anyone knows about Gödel's incompleteness theorem, super cool ideas of kind of like even with a consistent set of axioms, there are kind of statements that you can make within that system that you'll never actually be able to prove one way or the other, which is sort of, you know, they sort of exist in this weird liminal state. There's like extensions of that where, you know, we've got these kind of weird and wonderful different ideas that can be contradictory with one another that we just kind of have to say, well, if we're using this branch of mathematics, then we kind of accept these ideas. And if we're using another branch of mathematics, we accept the complete like opposite, and we can't necessarily resolve which branch is like true or false. So even in I say this only to say that even in our most kind of rigorous systems, this idea of liminality like kind of rears its head. As I say, we also see it in kind of physics, which suggests this is like something that we can kind of plausibly say is happening in the physical world, and that I think the main thing to notice is that we're not very good at reckoning with quantum systems, right? Like the idea of a particle going through one slit and another slit at the same time, but still that when we measure it, it behaves like a particle. That's really difficult to get our heads around. And yet this seems to kind of best explain the actual kind of nature of reality. The third area that it comes up outside of philosophy, I think, is maybe one of my favorite and kind of most applicable to philosophy, which is anthropology. So kind of the idea of, in like rites of passage, when we're kind of like forming our own identity, that that basically there's this critical kind of liminal stage, which is when kind of we've opened ourselves up to change and change is possible, but that change hasn't happened yet, and we're kind of like stuck between our kind of old self and our new self. And that's like kind of most often kind of characterized by ambiguity, disorientation, disembodiment, and kind of something that's often very unpleasant. We don't like it, which I wonder whether that's kind of similar to when we're trying to kind of unpack quantum, and it doesn't feel very nice to kind of think about these things in our head, kind of thing. And so I guess trying to kind of bring everything back to kind of a practical, completely kind of real world, kind of immediate real world sense. I've been finding with like the philosophy club, one criticism that people, especially when sort of going to the Victoria meetup in person, was that people were saying that they didn't like the kind of ritual that we were kind of engaging in very much, because there wasn't a strict definition that we were all working with, and there wasn't a kind of a sense of progress, which for me, I completely disagree with, and think that this is actually one of the better and more interesting things that I come out of these kind of sessions, talking about philosophy with a bunch of people I don't know necessarily very well outside of the club. I come out away kind of disoriented, and that my ideas are kind of disembodied from what they previously was. And so, yeah, this is hopefully that just kind of gives a bit of a flavor as to why this is a groovy topic to me. I have some questions just to kind of finish off that I'll kind of throw out towards the group. But feel free to just respond with whatever you're picking up on. But I guess some questions I have is like, for you guys, like, what does it feel like to stand between ideologies? And can you exist in that permanently, or is that something that we've just got to kind of like move between, and that it is this idea of kind of transitory and temporarily? It's like something that if we're gonna work with liminal states of mind and being, that like it's always going to be kind of like transitory. I'm also kind of interested if other folks know of kind of philosophers and philosophies that they think are kind of useful bridges between ideologies or kind of modes of thinking, and how has that kind of been constructive? How do we kind of tell apart like liminal thinking versus kind of unhelpful cognitive dissonance? Can we only get insight really from kind of like being at the limits of what we know, and we're kind of constantly having to cross these thresholds? Is that just like an inherent property of kind of gaining knowledge? And then I guess there's just like this idea of kind of like the self, in terms of like, I'm not sure if you guys know about like Heraclitus's ship of Theseus, but like if you replace every single part on a ship, is it still the same ship, kind of thing? And like, how can we apply that to ourselves? Which I think has some kind of obvious sense of kind of liminality to it. So with that, I'll throw things over to the group.
Thank you, Simon. That was insightful. Kirstyn, over to you.
Okay.